While you have 4,000 weeks in your life, you have 521 weeks to spend in your 20s, which can either sound like a bit of an abundance or like a ticking bomb. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am recovering from a deadly virus in my shed. So you might recall in the last video I recorded that went on this channel, I said this.
Have you had COVID yet? I actually have not had COVID yet. I do work from home and I have moved London and I've traveled everywhere and I don't have a massive difference. So I guess like that's maybe some of it. No. And then probably contracted coronavirus, but potentially one of the last people in Britain, it feels like, to have had COVID. What only remains is the cough, really. I think I'm on day 5 now and I feel fine. I'm just a little bit clogged up. It really wasn't the worst for me. I think my reaction to the jab was a lot worse, which obviously means that it worked, but it does mean that I've been spending a lot of time isolating. Turns out my suspicions were right. Isolating with a garden and more than 2 rooms to exist in is incredible if you are somebody who is living in a flat, as I was for lots of the times that I did isolate during the pandemic. It is a different experience than any of those house dwellers that try to tell you different. I would like to die on this hill that it's a completely different experience, and actually I'm totally fine is what I'm trying to say. I've actually had a kind of great time. But with this kind of isolation period has come this pressure to do something with the time that I'm always fighting, especially when you're ill. You should just be existing. You should be just a flesh puppet drinking fluids and trying to stay alive. But, you know, I was like, oh, okay, I'm indoors for a while. I can't really work. Like, is there anything that I can do that will make this time memorable or meaningful? Turns out the only 2 things that I have been able to do is decipher that Little Women is not a comfort film. I was trying to look for a cozy film to watch and I thought, what's the worst thing that happens in Little Women? Oh yeah, Beth dies. I think I could handle that. And I started watching it and then we got to the part where Amy burns Joe's manuscript and I was like, I forgot this was a horror film, turned it off. Maybe that's just more where my priorities lie. And then the other thing that came out of this is that I realised that you all have been sleeping on my ignorance and not helping me out by telling me that there is an adaptation of The Midsummer Night's Dream that features a very horny Stanley Tucci playing Puck and Christian Bale in a mud fight. I know, 1999 was a wild time. So I thought, because I don't completely fill up to making all these ambitious videos I'd love to make, I wanted to reflect a little bit more on the stuff I learned in this book, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. And because I'm always thinking about the 20s, I have this series called the 20s Toolkit. The thoughts that sprung out of me from reading this book about my 20s and the things that I maybe would like to pass on, should they be in any way helpful to you. Now, the title of the book is called 4,000 Weeks because that's how many weeks the average human has in their lifetime. Cue meltdown. I know, I wish there was whiskey in that mug. And it's a kind of anti-self-help book about time and productivity and how we view using our time and whether that's even sane. Now, breaking life up into data can either sometimes be helpful or incredibly unhelpful, but when it comes to your 20s, I actually think crunching the numbers is fascinating. So your 20s, if you are in the UK and therefore your life expectancy is an average of 81.6 years, will be 12% of your whole life. That really takes the pressure off getting it right? If you had a whole degree and then one module was worth 12%, you'd be like, yeah, it's important, but if I f it up, I can still save my grade. Do you know what I mean? But why does it feel so important when you're in it? Well, we'll crunch the numbers again. When you are at the beginning of your 20s, that time span of 10 years represents 50% of your life so far. So when you're looking forward at your 20s, about to enter it, of course it seems huge. And even at the end of your 20s, it ends up being 33% of your overall life banked, lived in that present moment. Just like when you're a kid and a year of school literally feels like a lifetime. Still blows my mind that I only went to school for like 30 weeks of the year and only from 9 till 3 p.m. Like, it felt like it was all of my life. But knowing the meaning of that time and how it feels to you now versus how it may feel towards the end of your life, I think is really valuable. And it's also interesting to know that while you have 4,000 weeks in your life, you have 521 weeks to spend in your 20s, which can either sound like a bit of an abundance or like a ticking bomb. So for somebody who has already lived their 20s, here are some of my learnings about what I think about how I spent my 20s, how I wish my mindset had been whilst in my 20s, inspired of course by some of the wonderful thoughts in this book.
Number 1, make a list of the whats, but know that they are secretly wise. I am no enemy of the goal list, the dream board, the aspiration table, but if I was to make a list of all the things that I thought my 20s should contain, the goals that I would have had before I entered them, they'd probably have gone like this. Pass my driving test, marry, beep, get into drama school, buy a minivan, travel the world, and get thin. If I'm being brutally honest, those would probably be my goals. Have I failed at those things and many others? 100% totally. Release the lever, done cleaner, she's dead, she's out. However, if I was to break that list into the whys, why I wanted those things, pass my driving test so I could feel like an adult and be free, marry, beep, so I can have a long-term fulfilling partnership that grows me emotionally and spiritually, get into drama school so I don't have to have an office job, buy a minivan so I never have to find the perfect place to live, I can just drain all the great bits of all the different places in the world to live and have them all in one little van. Basically, never make a decision about anything. Travel the world so I can be a more well-rounded person, get thin so I can accept myself and stop wasting so much time thinking about my body. I mean, we only have 521 weeks, people. If I think about the whys of why I wanted those things, I haven't failed at all. I was wrong about the direction. My route picker was completely off, but a lot of those things I do have, just not through the media my little teenage brain predicted, and that's totally fine. A good example, I think, of that is travel in general. There's a section in this book called The Decline of Pleasure, and it talks about us trying to capture things rather than actually experiencing them, and it has this sentence that absolutely kicked me in the spiritual nuts. Even an undertaking as seemingly hedonistic as a year spent backpacking around the globe could fall victim to the same problem. If your purpose isn't to explore the world, but, a subtle distinction this, to add to your mental storeroom of experiences in the hope that you'll feel later on that you used your life well. Now, I hold two slightly contradictory truths in my head, and the ability to do that supposedly is one that's mature and intelligent, so hopefully I can master that, and that's okay to have both. One, I think that some of the big ticket, big moment travel experiences in my life have formed a good part of my own understanding of myself, self-resilience, etc, etc. I think they've largely been beneficial. But in the other corner, ding ding, is the fact that most people that I've met that were incredibly well travelled, i.e. way more travelled than me, and have been to, like, you know, they have one of those little cork things on the wall where they scratch off all the different countries they've been to, aren't that interesting. Like, there is a correlation. Interesting people I've met, people that are well travelled, they're there, just about here, but it's never a direct correlation, and I have actually been flabbergasted by the some people that I've met in my 20s that can list off all these incredible sublime experiences that they have had and places they have physically, geographically been, but don't seem to have an incredibly expansive understanding of what it means to be human, or, to be honest, a great elastic knowledge of different cultures and different mindsets and international politics, to be honest. And I'm not saying that I do, but I thought those things would correlate a little bit more. And when I thought about my own travel experiences and why they were valuable, I realised they're not actually valuable for the reasons that I thought they would be valuable. I've written down here in my notes, travel is transformative because it's hard. It's a hard experience, especially if you're like really young and you don't have much money and you're trying to navigate a completely new culture and a completely new system. That's a hard experience. It's not inherently the travel itself that I found transformative, but trying something that I was terrified to do that's completely outside of my comfort zone. I spent my gap year doing two probably very unglamorous things for different reasons. I spent 10 months of it working for £3.83 an hour in general kind of customer service roles, various different jobs, so that I had enough money to have a plane ticket to the US of A to spend 2 months volunteering with AmeriCorps and doing some manual labour in the desert, which wasn't glamorous, but is a cool story. And it felt to me at the time like the 10 months weren't the cool story and the 2 months were the making of me. And looking back at it, I actually think the 10 months impacted and positively influenced the rest of my 20s way more than the 2 months ever could have, because that was the incredibly hard, seemingly insurmountable character building, hate that term, but you know what I mean, that was the, unbeknownst to me at the time, incredibly transformative time, and it gave me the interpersonal skills, the emotional intelligence to get jobs in my 20s, to form real connections with people in my 20s, because I'm not even going to go into this, but I mean, if you haven't worked in customer service, it's hard to describe, but if you know, you know. I now realise that not all travel experiences are created equal. There are lots of ways, especially as Westerners, for us to walk on the ground of another country, but not actually engage with anything that country is or stands for, or anybody who lives there. I don't consider that a meaningful travel experience, and there are lots of ones I never got to go on in my 20s, and I've started to regret that less and less. I've had some incredibly meaningful ones, and I've made some incredible friends in loads of different cultures and places, but when it comes to depth, I think you can learn as much about humanity behind a customer service desk as you can on a 2-week photogenic hiking trip with a bunch of trust fund kids. It also boggles my mind that I have a picture of me standing outside a pyramid, and yet to this day retained next to nothing about modern day Egypt, ancient Egypt. Involved in a party conversation about Egypt, I would have as much to contribute as somebody who had watched horrible histories. Also, the reality check moment of getting to the pyramids and realising that almost all of the artefacts that would have been relevant to see in that geographical location had actually been stored a couple of 100 miles down the road in London from where I had been living for most of my frickin' life. Video essay for another day, but to summarise my thoughts on that, gross. Number 2, you would blow your ancestors' mind. Even if you don't do anything during your 20s, if you barely achieve anything, what your everyday, day-to-day experience and your opportunities look like would probably make past generations of you go, what? My granddad did not have much money at all. He was in and out of work his whole life. He didn't really get that much of an education, and he was kind of like a plumber slash decorator and had various different odd jobs. He didn't have much expendable income, but for all of my childhood, when I was growing up, he'd already died by this point, there was this huge set of Encyclopedia Britannicas in the house. If you are Gen Z and you don't know what Encyclopedia Britannica is, it's this. But the household legend was that he saved and scrimped all of his money and bought each one of these in the collection, one for each letter of the alphabet, over years and years, because he thought they would be valuable. And why wouldn't you if you were living and working in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s? Encyclopedia Britannica seemed like a great bet. All of the knowledge of the world in your house. No subscription fee, no need to enter a certain club or go to a certain university. On paper, nobody can steal it from you. In your house. I did actually use that because hashtag did my homework without the internet quite a few times in my early teens, but as it got towards my late teens, it became increasingly obvious that using these Encyclopedia Britannicas that had been bought during the 50s, 60s, 70s were no longer the most accurate or most efficient way for me to access any kind of information about the world. And that was interesting to me. One, because I think it taught me that even though the books were kind of obsolete, education is worth investing in. Like, curiosity should be like a financial priority. But also, by the very act of having bought all those encyclopedias, I knew that my life would have blown my granddad's mind. So just know that whatever you do with your 20s, whether you go back just one generation or 5, 10, the stuff that you're able to do with an evening, whether that's falling down a Wikipedia hole or doing 3 loads of laundry in a row, eating a delicious donut you didn't have to cook, having sex without the moral or legal obligation to raise a child, these are all things that like people in my family before me would have weeped to do. However I used my time in my 20s, I was incredibly lucky to be able to use my time that way, and to tell my ancestors that I wasted my 20s and then relay to them what I did, they would probably be like, that sounds like a freaking ball, it sounds like you had a great time. In this book it talks about this other book called More Work for Mother by an American historian, Ruth Schwartz Cohen, who talks about when housewives first got access to labour-saving devices like washing machines and vacuum cleaners. You would expect that to have made women's lives better. No? But instead, societal expectations changed and the standards of cleanliness simply rose to offset the benefits. Now that you could return each of your husband's shirts to a spotless condition after a single wearing, it began to feel like you should. And this whole like work expands to fill the time is human nature, but I think it's worth noting that it's not a trap that we have to fall into, and becoming grateful for the small things we can do because of collective effort
and cumulative human advancement is bloody incredible. Number 3. Aim to close off your choices. In the book, it talks about the origin of the Latin word to decide, or decidere, actually means to cut off, as in slicing away alternatives. And I often felt like that in my 20s. I felt like I was kind of building a life for myself, but every decision I made, every fork in the road I took, every day that went by, I was also cutting off decisions. I was letting things go. I was boxing myself in. Now I see that there are often a lot of options in your life as you get older, but you're kind of deepening those options and narrowing them rather than widening them. For example, I picked an English degree. Yeah, that probably fucked up my chances of ever being a vet. I chose to do it in rural Wales, which fucked up my chances of ever doing an exchange degree in a beautiful hot country or learning another language in my 20s. But choosing an English degree opened my brain up to this whole other world of thinking and gave me loads of new options for careers I could choose and things that I could pursue. And living in Wales gave me a deeper understanding of some of my ancestral home, because my grandma was Welsh, and having grown up in like the 10th biggest city in the UK on busy roads and noisy places, living by the sea in an incredibly small town gave me a touch with nature that I don't think I would ever have gotten otherwise. Oliver Burkeman's critique of time management I think is really interesting. He says, the real measure of any time management technique is whether or not it helps you neglect the right things. So any time management technique shouldn't like promise that it's going to stop you from having to neglect any responsibilities or any tasks, but helps you to neglect the right things. Number 4, find your atelic activity. What's an atelic activity, I hear you ask? Well, according to the book, it's from the philosopher Kieran Setia, and he calls it an atelic activity means that its value isn't derived from its telos or ultimate aim. He talks about this idea of leisure time being wasteful time, and how actually he thinks that time focused solely on the pleasure of the experience is the only way to not waste time. In order to most fully inhabit the only life that you get, you have to refrain from using every spare hour for personal growth. And then he talks again about the hobbyist as somebody who is subversive. He insists that some things are worth doing for themselves alone, despite offering no payoffs in terms of productivity or profit. Not to be confused with a side hustle, because I think I have learned a lot about freelance, and I've talked a lot on my channel about that, and I think the most of it is great, and I've had side hustles for a lot of my 20s. I think they have a time limit on them if you're going to look after your mental health and your physical health, but I do think to some extent they are fun and good and can benefit you long term. But I also think that he's right when he talks about like learning about those atelic activities, which are slightly different from the skills that I have learned from side hustling or my career. So if I think about the things that I've learned are my atelic activities, things that I don't care if they have any payoff, I genuinely just enjoy them for what they are. Through trial and error, here are the things that I have learned in my 20s are mine, and this is really towards the end of my 20s I started realising that these are the actual things rather than things I thought they were. Walking tours. Do I care to remember any of the facts that are told to me in a walking tour? No. Do I like just absorbing the fact that there is this much history in the world and somebody knows it? Absolutely. Browsing bookshops, even without buying books. Sitting and watching other people, probably in cafes, that kind of thing. Musicals, being in them, watching them, whatever it is, I don't care if that has any kind of output. The moment is what matters to me. Drinking, dancing, laughing. They're very simple. Some of them are probably quite generic, but as we know, I'm quite a basic bitch. And some of these things are things that might seem quite unadventurous or small to other people, but when I think about the things that are important to me and I actually feel like I do get leisure out of, those are some of the things that I came up with. And I think knowing that those are slightly separate from the skills that you're trying to cultivate, which are really important but do not count as leisure time, is important, so you can segment them and make sure you're having a balanced life. And finally, develop a taste for chaos. This is slightly adapted from page 180, in which Oliver Burkeman advises that you first develop a taste for having problems, and most of the anguish that we get from trying to plan our lives and trying to control our time is this idea
that we won't have any problems, or there is a moment where everything will be completely calm and without blemish. I wish I had started my 20s seeing it as what it really is to me now, a data collecting activity. I collected so much data about what I want, what I enjoy, what I believe about the world, what I think makes an admirable person, what makes a good life, and if I'd seen it that way, I think I would have been a little bit calmer about it. But how was I supposed to be able to plan my 20s, know how to spend it, if I'm only about 14% of the way through my whole life at the beginning of it, and let's face it, at 20, at 0% through my adult life? You are a beginner at being yourself when you're in your 20s, and I think there is value in remembering that. He warns against the kind of productivity advice that has ideal morning routines, strictly personal schedules, tactics for limiting how long you spend answering email each day, plus homilies on the importance of learning to say no, all of them functioning as bulwarks against the risk that other people might exert too much influence on how your time gets used. Undoubtedly, these do have a role to play. We do need to set firm boundaries so that bullying bosses, exploitative employment arrangements, narcissistic spouses, or guilty tendencies toward people-pleasing don't end up dictating the course of your day. But he also points out that planning your own self-improvement, planning your own time, negates the fact that your life overlaps with loads of other people's lives, both on a personal and political level. And yet the trouble with this kind of individualistic freedom is that a society ends up desynchronizing itself. We live less and less of our lives in the same temporal grooves as one another. And then later on he says all of this comes with political implications too, because grassroots politics, world meetings, rallies, desynchronizing protests and canvassing are the most important coordinated activities, and if we all desynchronize and just focus on our own schedules, flames are fanned, shit goes down, to summarize his words. Should go without saying to Mini Lena, but you are not God. You cannot understand what is best for your 20s without hindsight. And not only what will you need, but what the world needs will be unpredictable by the time you are 30. Completely unimaginable to you. Just like my granddad with his encyclopedias. I honestly wish I could show you the whole collection, because it's big and it's actually quite grand and quite funny. But you know, I'm out here still testing positive for a deadly virus and just trying not to kill my parents. Just 2022 things. 521 weeks. If you're in your 20s or about to enter them, what would you like to do with all those weeks? Or if you have left your 20s, like me, graduated, self-scored, first class honours, what are you glad you did with those 521 weeks? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this video, you might like my series 20s Toolkit. That is over here. Thank you for bearing with the slightly coffee, rough shed content while I recover from COVID-19. The Queen of Darkness herself. Do subscribe if you'd like to stay around. Thank you so much to the Gumption Club for making these videos possible. Frogsnug out.